Busy and full week. Today's convocation is brought to us by an endowment from the Staley Foundation, which is persuaded that the message of the Christian gospel, when proclaimed in its historic fullness, is always contemporary, relevant, and meaningful to any generation. This morning, we are very pleased, once again, to get to hear from writer, speaker, global educator, and advocate Karen Gonzalez. Gonzalez is the author of The God Who Sees, which is one of the common texts for this year's iteration of Bethel College's capstone course for all seniors, Basic Issues of Faith and Life. And what a delight it is to get to hear from the author herself, and in person here in this place. Gonzalez writes both from professional experience as an immigration advocate, as well as from personal experience immigrating from Guatemala to the United States. In addition to writing, Gonzalez has been an educator both in public school settings in the United States, as well as living and working globally in places like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Russia, and Azerbaijan. It was in part this global professional experience that prompted her to pursue advanced theological education, and she holds a graduate degree in theology and missiology from Fuller Theological Seminary in California. Gonzalez has lived in Baltimore, Maryland for the past decade or so, where she currently serves with World Relief, a Christian humanitarian organization that pursues holistic, locally driven solutions that lead to lasting change. In the United States, World Relief especially works to support refugees and immigrants building their lives in a new country. In addition to all these things, she enjoys cooking Guatemalan food, traveling, watching baseball, especially Dodgers baseball, and playing with her nieces. Last night, she spoke to us on grace and truth in the immigration conversation, content tied to her current book, The God Who Sees. Today's address is connected especially to a forthcoming book, Beyond Welcome, centering immigrants in our Christian response to immigration. Karen, thank you so much for being with us here for these lectures. We have already learned much, and we look forward to hearing you today as you speak to us on a theology of land and belonging. Please join me in giving Karen Gonzalez a warm Thresher welcome.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and good morning. It's good to be here with you today. So as Peter told you, I'm from Central America. So I want to open by talking to you about one of our myths from our indigenous communities. And in Guatemala, it was primarily the Mayan people. So according to the Mayan creation myth, there were two deities, Tepeu and Cucumats. And they decided to create human beings because the animals could not speak to or worship them. So first they created human beings from mud clay. These humans had no soul. They were ugly. They were not well formed. They couldn't speak or walk. They couldn't worship their creators. And when it rained, their crumbly selves just melted away. So the deities tried a second time. This time, they were determined to make a hardier race of human beings. So they created them from wood. These humans were strong. They were able to walk, talk, they reproduced upon the earth. However, they had no minds, no ability to show care and compassion because their hearts were empty. They were ungrateful, and they were unwilling to praise their creators. So the deities sent a great flood, and this flood was designed to destroy them, and they also turned creation against them. The animals attacked the surviving wood people and tore them apart. But those who managed to escape ran to the forests, where they were turned into monkeys. The deities tried again. They wanted humans who would live rightly in the world they had created. Now, when some of the animals brought them stacks of white corn that grew in the far end of the earth, they took the corn, they ground it into a paste, and they formed human beings from corn. These human beings were exactly what the deities wanted. They were hardy, they were strong, and their mouths praised their creators in gratitude. These people of corn were respectful of creation, and they walked humbly on the earth that sustained them. So they were the people allowed to remain on the earth. In Guatemala, it's common for us to say, when we're challenged, that we're not strong enough to do something, that we are, that we're people of corn. The writer Robin Wall Kimmerer finds it curious that the Mayan creation myth says that people are made of corn because corn cannot exist without human beings to tend and sow it. Corn is the product of its relationship to human beings. She says the sacred plant of our creation created people, and people created corn. So in other words, we live in reciprocity to one another in a mutually beneficial. Now, for many years, this creation myth was interesting to me just as a point of learning about my origins, my country of origin. And I didn't know how much it had to teach me about God and about God's creation. But Native American theologians have taught me that it can be both. Now, I find it remarkable how little most Christians think about a theology of land and belonging. And that's because we serve the God of Israel, the God who brought the people out of slavery and into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. Much of Israel's story is deeply rooted in land. Their displacement from it, their longing to be returned to it. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul recognizes that both people and the land cry out for freedom, for liberation, because there's a divine connection between human beings, the land, and the creatures of the earth. Now, truthfully, most Christians would not dispute these connections. We affirm that God gave human beings stewardship over the creation, and that the gift of land comes with both responsibilities as well as opportunities. But yet, our Western understanding of the world is one where humankind is at the very epitome of creation. I think this is perhaps a remnant from the Renaissance, where humanism, where the humans and the human body were at the very peak of the creation. Now, in indigenous teachings, the world is seen very differently. Both human beings and the land, human beings are central to creation. They live in reciprocity. The humans take care of the land takes care of the humans. And the land does this, of course, by being fruitful, by providing for our sustenance and our well-being. The people of corn tend and sow the corn. The land cares for the humans care for the land. People and land are different, but they're equally valuable in this worldview because they need one another. Now, more interesting is that the land doesn't really belong to human beings. It belongs to God. It belongs to the Creator. Wendell Berry writes, "The descendants of Israel were given not a land, but the use of a land, along with precise instructions for its good care. They could keep the land only on the condition By their disobedience, they were estranged from the land and the covenant by which they received it, and were removed into exile. So the human beings are only stewards, only have use of the land. Leviticus says, "The land shall not be sold, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants." The psalmist also acknowledges this. The psalmist says, "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it." And even King David chimes in. He wants to acknowledge the Creator as the only owner of the land and the people's status as foreigners passing through it. "For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. For we are aliens and transients before you, as were all our ancestors. Our days on the earth are like a shadow." Now, for many of us who live in the world where land is a commodity, something that we buy and we sell, it's challenging to think of the land as belonging to God. Now, we might acknowledge it in a general sense, and we might express gratitude to God, the Creator, for a beautiful landscape, maybe something we encounter on a hike, maybe a beautiful sunset on the beach. But ultimately, the land is ours, because we don't live as if the land belongs to God alone. I sometimes try to imagine what it must have been like for my indigenous ancestors to have encountered the Spanish conquistadors who arrived. These were people who arrived and said, "This land is mine." They must have been so confused, because in their understanding, only the Creator owned the land. Their culture and their practices did not allow for commodifying it, for buying and selling it. Shawnee chief and warrior Tecumseh expressed that buying and selling land was akin to selling air and water. How could they sell something that was lent to them by the Creator? In the history of humankind, land has been the most important resource, one that was created for our sustenance, but does not ultimately belong to us. Biblical scholar Sifiso Mopofu says, "Having been given land by God, the people of Israel entered into a covenant relationship based on love, justice, and equitable distribution of land." The people of Israel enjoyed fair and just access to land by all citizens. Under this model, whenever powerful citizens attempted to usurp the land of the poor, the prophets cried out and condemned their actions. God made special provisions to protect the land and, by extension, to protect the poor and the marginalized from those who would behave irresponsibly and hoard it. Because in God's economy, the land should never become a source of disillusionment, of dispossession, of exploitation, of enslavement, or death. The scriptures say, "The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor, says the Lord of hosts." So I'm here with you today because in 1954, the CIA overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected president and his government. The dispute was over land. Guatemala's president, his name was Jacobo Arbenz, proposed land reforms that were considered a threat to the economic interest of United Fruit Company. This is a U.S. company that has enormous economic power in Guatemala, still does today. UFC now is known as Chiquita Brands International. You might have seen the Chiquita stickers on bananas that you buy in the grocery store. So UFC lobbied the US government to prevent the reforms that would have granted land to the indigenous people who worked it, because this change would have ended their monopoly and their exploitative labor practices. And their campaign was successful. They labeled President Arbenz a communist, a socialist, something that was very harmful in 1954. And just as the government was coming in to overthrow his administration, President Arbenz fled into exile. What followed Arben's rule was a series of military dictatorships, all of them supported by the US, and that eventually brought the country into a civil war, resulting in the deaths of at least 200,000 people, mostly indigenous. So this war that began over land disputes was started by one small group of wealthy Americans who exploited, dispossessed, disillusioned, and ultimately caused the deaths of poor Guatemalan indigenous people. Now, if these privileged and powerful Americans were the wealthy and unjust of ancient Israel, God's judgment would have come down on them swiftly. Their lands, the lands that they took by force, would have been taken from them, and they would have been exiled as punishment for disobeying their God by mistreating the poor. We can't really discuss a theology of land and belonging without discussing the impact of empires. For ancient Israel, the oppressive empires were Egypt, Babylon, and Rome. But for many in the global south today, particularly in the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Africa, the oppressive empire is the United States. I wasn't born in 1954. In fact, my parents were toddlers in 1954. But I'm here in the US because the US was in Guatemala, overthrowing my country's democratically elected government and setting off a chain of events that resulted in a brutal civil war that eventually caused my family's migration. I am here because they were there. The American dream has become a nightmare for many in the global south because our lives have become disposable for the sake of the comfort and well-being of the few in North America. Our homelands are decimated, mined, and exploited to make the good life possible for people in the North. And as our countries become economically exploited and become almost unlivable, some of us seek to migrate, to find a better life. But life on the move doesn't provide the solace that we seek. There's so many injustices that migrants experience in the modern world. Today's forced immigrants are like Israel in the wilderness. Israel embarked on a journey believing that the promised land lies ahead. But unlike the Israelites, we don't experience migration as a justice event. Our quest for justice is an ongoing struggle. And that struggle is exacerbated, it's aggravated by the militarization of borders that prevent us from finding our own promised land, the place where we can rest in safety and in freedom. How we view the land and how we theologize about it matters in the immigration conversation because it has implications for immigrants. And make no mistake, the question of immigration is ultimately one of belonging. Who belongs on the land? Who does not belong on the land? There's a Chicana writer you might have heard of. Her name is Gloria Ansaldúa. And she has referred to the U.S.-Mexico border as una herida abierta, an open wound, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. She lived in these borderlands, and she experienced the affliction of this open wound, the physical, economic, communal, and psychological violence that it inflicts on all the people who live there. I think this image of a gaping wound is very powerful, and it really does evoke the humanitarian crisis that exists in the borderlands. Now, I want you to know I'm purposefully using the word borderlands and not borders, because people have lived in these lands for centuries. This imaginary line, the border that was created, that came much, much later. So my last visit to the borderlands occurred in the spring of 2019, right before the pandemic. And I found myself in El Paso, and I crossed over to its Mexican border, Ciudad Juarez. It's the farthest west I had ever been in Texas. Now, across the bridge in Ciudad Juarez, things feel very different. It looks very similar, but it's visibly poorer. And I didn't cross the border on my own. I crossed it with a group of mostly white Christians who were interested in learning and advocating for and standing in solidarity with immigrants. They were all people who recognize the injustices that are part of everyday life in these communities. The inability to move across the border and access resources or be reunited with family members. We visited migrant shelters in Ciudad Juarez that are run by different churches, both Protestant and Roman Catholic. And we encountered lots of immigrants from Central America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and from Cuba. Now, I could see that many people that were in my group were deeply touched by their interactions with these migrants. They were touched by their stories. They asked thoughtful questions, and they listened attentively. And some of them were really overcome with emotion, with despair, with hopelessness. On our way back to El Paso, we didn't cross on foot. We crossed the bridge in a van. And we talked openly about the things we had seen, about the things we had heard, the things we'd experienced. Everyone discussed the importance of advocating, of discipling the church, of putting pressure on our legislators to reform the immigration process, to have more welcoming policies, to share their stories with their churches and with their friends back home. But nobody questioned what was, to me, the most obviously problematic aspect of the situation. And that's that we live in a society that made us believe that those migrants didn't belong in the U.S. unless they entered through a legal process, that they were trying to access a land that belonged to other people. The driver of the van, he was born in El Paso to Mexican parents and had been raised traveling back and forth between the two cities. He was really timid and shy, but he told us this land was once all connected, and it was known as Paso del Norte. It was one community, and then the border was built right through the middle of it. I think Ansaldúa is right about the border itself. I think it is an open wound, and it sheds blood day after day with impunity. It separates families, it separates communities, and it creates the opportunity for exploitation, for criminality. It causes death, and it causes destruction. The border is the enemy, not the people who inhabit the borderlands. Because this barbed wire fence, or this wall that you hear about, first it pierces the earth before it pierces those who crawl under it. It harms both land and people. So how do we heal this open wound? In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus illustrates what it means to love your neighbor. He tells a story of a Samaritan man who encountered a foreign man on the road. And this man, as you know from this famous story, has been beaten and robbed. Now, it's noteworthy that the Samaritan man does not walk by the wounded man and forget him. Like, oh, it's too bad what happened to you. He also doesn't stop to pray for him and then go on. He doesn't stop to just consider advocating for safer roads to Jericho before he just moves on to his destination. He feels compassion, and he takes full responsibility for the hurt stranger. He tends to his wounds, he bandages them, and then he picks him up and takes him to an inn. And there he continues to take care of him, and he pays the innkeeper to look after him. The Samaritan practices a holistic ethic of love for his neighbor, one that is costly and sacrificial. It's not sentimental, and it's not convenient. I think bringing healing to the earth and to immigrants in the borderlands will be similarly costly and sacrificial. It's going to require us to follow immigrants rather than lead. Perhaps the very act of sneaking under a thin edge of barbed wire, of transgressing in a natural boundary, is God's way of inviting us to participate in the healing of wounds. After all, God always works through unlikely heroes, the people who are rejected by those in power, the ones we least expect to lead movements and bring transformation. Perhaps immigrants will be the ones to bring healing to the wounded earth. Perhaps they will save Native citizens from the judgment that awaits those who ignore the plight of the wounded and go on about their days. Perhaps, rather than condemn immigrants who enter the country unlawfully, we should applaud them for subverting an unjust system, for obeying God's laws above human-made ones. There's a book called Embracing Hopelessness by a biblical ethicist and scholar named Miguel de la Torre. And he talks about a theology and ethic of messing with the system. He calls it something a little more crude than that, but I'm just going to say messing with the system for our purposes. He says that an ethics of messing with the system is a practice of liberation by which society is transformed, because messing with the system, the immigration system in particular, and the way that it prevents access to land and resources is the only ethical response in the hope of creating new opportunities through disorder and chaos. Now, under this framework, immigrants swim across the Rio Grande and enter the country without being admitted. They subvert the law. This ethic might also lead citizens, like us, to provide sanctuary in their churches to immigrants, to help them as they seek to reunite their families. Under this ethic, Native citizens might also block an ICE agent from taking away their neighbors. Or it might lead them to do what over 600 Catholic women did in Washington, D.C. They gathered in the Capitol building on the floor of the Senate office, and they wrapped themselves in metallic silver blankets, very similar to those given to migrant children who are separated from their families in the borderlands. Under this ethic, immigrants and citizens come together, and they stop simply hoping that the system is going to change and become more just. There's a kind of hope that keeps waiting for change, and that can be oppressive, and it can prevent us from seeking creative solutions and new possibilities. Now, this isn't anarchy, and it isn't stealing land back, but rather it's a nonviolent survival strategy based on love, designed to liberate the abused from death-dealing social structures that deny their humanity. And it's also liberating to the abusers, because their humanity is lost through their complicity in these structures. That's one way to heal the open wound. But it's also going to require the paying of reparations. Many people in the United States think that our countries in the developing world are poor. Countries in Africa, countries in Latin America, Asia. But our countries are not poor. They have been looted for the enrichment of other countries. The Samaritan took full financial responsibility for wounds he did not cause. He restored a stranger to health at his own expense. What are North American countries willing to do? What are we as Christians willing to advocate for? At the end of the parable, Jesus tells the lawyer, "Go and do likewise," meaning go and show mercy and care for your neighbor just as the Samaritan did. When we center immigrants in the immigration conversation, we have to reevaluate how we think about land and belonging. And this is going to require us to stand in opposition to empires and to proclaim that the land is for all of us. We don't accept and enforce the empire's status quo, and we don't settle for systems of injustice because that's the way things have always been. God meant for the world to be different, and it's our duty to bring about this vision of creation that God intended. And this is a vision where the land has no owner but God. And we live in reciprocity. We take care of the land, and the land takes care of us. We heal the open wound by bringing down the walls, the barbed wire, and the fences that pierce the land. And this work has to start with our own paradigm shift. I think most of us have accepted borders and the violence associated with them as normal. But what if we envisioned lands without borders? What if all of us envisioned the land as truly belonging to God? What if we reimagined our relationship to land? I used to think those kinds of questions were idealistic and unhelpful. I'm a practical person by nature, and I didn't see any point in considering that. I mean, we live in a reality where borders exist, and then we have for a long time. But I've become aware of how societal shifts happen, and they begin with ideas and conversations. So when I was 18, 1990, I remember being in Puebla, Mexico. I was with my father, and we were going to a seminar at a university, and it was a seminar on Christopher Columbus's invasion of America. Not discovery, invasion of America. And this was in 1990. I had never heard anyone talk about Columbus invading America. It seemed ludicrous to me to host a seminar on this, on something that would never change in the court of public opinion. Now, but just 40 years later, 40 years, this is an insignificant number, historically speaking. We have state governments in the US replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. We have statues of Columbus all over the world, not just here in the US. They're defaced, beheaded, destroyed. And we have a changing narrative that focuses on the actual history surrounding Columbus's trips and the damage, the genocide that it inflicted on indigenous communities. Even in Christian spaces, people are recognizing the enormous harm unleashed by Columbus and his invasion. Churches pray for healing, for the restoration of indigenous communities, and Christians are openly critiquing the history we were taught about Columbus's heroism. Change can and does happen, but it requires us to take the first step of reimagining the world and changing the narrative. I'm asked frequently if I believe in open borders. Usually it's asked as a kind of litmus test, like, is this woman way too radical for me to engage her in the conversation. But why is it radical to believe in open borders? Why is it radical to proclaim that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it? We are right to be concerned about borders, but our concern should be about whether preventing movement across borders to access resources is actually biblical or Christian or even good. It's become customary now when you go to a conference or you go to some church services that they often open with land acknowledgements. That they announce that we are sitting on the land of a particular indigenous community. I think these acknowledgements are really good. We're acknowledging that people were displaced. The first people who experienced displacement on this continent were indigenous communities. This reminds all of us that it's important to remember these stories, that people were moved from their historical lands. And I think it's important to do this, but I think we should go further. I think you should also remind all of us who follow this God-man Jesus, who walked the earth, that the land is not a commodity to buy and sell. The land is a gift from our Creator for us to steward. All of these land acknowledgements, they should acknowledge that God gave us all fair access to land for our good, so that the land would be a source of life, of sustenance, of freedom, and hope. Let me close us in prayer before we move to a time of Q&A. God of land, we've been looking for place and belonging ever since Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden. In our search, we've lost our connection to the land. We have not stewarded the land that belongs to you. Instead, we have exploited it, and we've exploited our neighbors. Free us from our tendency to see land as a commodity rather than a gift from you. In your mercy, bring us back to a vision of land as a source of life and well-being for all of us and not just for a few. Remind us of this gift of reciprocity, where we care for the land and the land cares for us. Above all, make us people who are generous with what you have freely given us, including the land and its resources. Give us the courage to reimagine the world around us. Amen.
Let's express our gratitude to Karen Gonzalez for her address to us this morning. And we do have some time for questions, so if you have a question, the microphone is in the center of the floor here.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the importance of language. Like in your book, you said that people can't be illegal, so you use undocumented, and as you said, using borderlands instead of borders, and maybe victims versus survivors.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, language is really powerful, and language shapes reality, not just in the immigration conversation, but in any conversation. Just a subtle shift from calling someone a survivor versus a victim, like you just said, is really important, right? Because it focuses on that person's agency and resiliency and strength, their ability to heal and recover. And it's the same in immigration. And this is why people who are advocates in immigration don't use terms like illegals, aliens, because these terms are dehumanizing. We use terms that focus on the humanity of people. So we say undocumented immigrants. And I have a good friend who goes even a step further. She'll always say immigrant people, refugee people, asylum-seeking people, because she says people forget so much that we're talking about human beings with whom we have a shared humanity, that she just wants to emphasize it every single time. And language really does matter. I was telling a group that I was talking to last night that when I was in Canada, I found out they only call people refugee and refugee claimants. But in the US, we have so many terms to talk about immigrants. But each of those terms allows us to maybe shake off some responsibility for our neighbors. Just think of something like refugee versus migrant. If I call someone a refugee, I'm talking about a person being persecuted, a person fleeing for their very life. But if I call someone a migrant, that's just someone maybe seeking a better life in another country. So if I call someone a migrant, I don't have to care or take responsibility. But if I call someone a refugee and I deny them entry, I'm sending them back. I'm sending them to certain death and harm. So the way that we play with language really does matter. And it's had historically terrible consequences. In fact, there was a ship during World War II that brought Jewish refugees to the United States and to other places in North America, and they were denied entry as migrants. They really were refugees. Over half of them died in the camps in Europe because they were treated as migrants and not as refugees. So it has life and death consequences, the language that we use. Sometimes people tell me, aren't you just kind of slicing things a little too thin? Does this really matter? But it really does matter. Think about even something that sounds really harmless, like we welcome refugees. That sounds really harmless and like a good thing. But that sentence has a subject. It's we. We are the subject. It has an object too. The object is refugees. They receive action. They don't take action. And that matters. There's a group in that sentence that has power and agency and a group that does not. A group that just receives whatever it is they get. So that matters. There was a church in Baltimore in my community that the neighborhood around them has changed. In the last 20 years, it's become a heavenly Central American immigrant neighborhood. And the church is still a white Lutheran church. And they held this festival for the community. And they wanted to come up with a name for it. And they knew that it was important. In the end, they called it Neighbors Welcoming Neighbors because they didn't want to make their neighbors in the community feel like, oh, you're new, you don't belong here. Somehow you're new, and we get to welcome you because this is our land, and you get to be welcome here. Neighbors welcoming neighbors. I thought it was really powerful that they stopped to make even something that small a consideration that was important for them in how they viewed and talked about their neighbors. So language absolutely matters. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Marissa. So you talk about the history of Christians and basically the religion in itself and how it affects indigenous communities, but also I didn't hear anything about how it still affects them now from the history back then, like say from residential schools and also the genocide. So whenever I'm indigenous, whenever I hear that like the land is God's land, I personally cannot take that upon myself to believe in that just because of like the Christian view of how indigenous people see that. So would you say like there could be another way to phrase how the land is or who owns the land or what the land is to people that are indigenous that do not believe in, say, the Christianity religion?
Sure. So I want to, thank you for asking the question. I want to clarify that I'm coming from a Christian perspective. Yes, I'm indigenous like most people in Latin America who are, mestizo, they're mixed race. And I'm speaking specifically more about Central America rather than the United States. But I think this is an ongoing conversation, and we don't live in a theocracy, right? We live in a constitutional republic here in the U.S. And there are a lot of Christians in the U.S. that still don't really think about, their view of land is really consistent with sort of what the world thinks about it. And they don't really think about, well, what does my faith actually teach about how I should look at land? And so that's really what I was getting at. But I think there's still a lot of space for us. I certainly haven't resolved the issue or come up with all the answers, but for me, this was the beginning of really asking a lot of questions as a Christian person of what does the scripture say about land and what does it say about belonging? And it's true, there's still, in my country, there's still ongoing harm to indigenous communities as well. There's not just harm that is physical, but also destruction of languages, of cultures, of people continuing to lose land that has been what they do historically. And then there's the changes that have come about because of society, like climate change is really affecting people, indigenous communities, because they live very close to the land. And when a land starts having frequent droughts and not producing, or you have to move further north because it's too dry, that affects indigenous communities as well. So yeah, there is a lot involved in that conversation that I didn't touch on, and you're absolutely right. But I think it's a narrative that we need to start talking about. There are scholars talking about these things, but in a culture at large, we're still not really thinking about these things. We're still thinking, I hear a lot of Christians talk about, well, how can we have secure and safe borders? And I'm like, why are we as Christians thinking about creating division between human beings, blocking them from accessing historical ancestral lands that have been in their communities for generations? Why aren't we discussing that? And that was my goal, was really to expand the narrative. But you're absolutely right. I did not touch on everything, and there's still a lot more to look at. But thank you for your question.
Follow-up question. So about the lands and stuff. So since we are going through a global climate change and stuff, and with indigenous communities, we keep 78% of the biodiversity around the world. So do you think that a solution to that would be giving back those lands to indigenous people? Not as quite pushing out non-natives from those lands, but letting natives take control of those instead of having the pipelines or mining everywhere. Even though it does kind of put America itself in a production loss, do you think it would rather benefit us more if we would give those lands back to natives, or if we would just keep it the same now?
Yeah. I had an experience, I used to work for World Vision, and I had an experience once where I was in East Africa, and I was in a village community, and I was just visiting with a soil scientist and a hydrologist. They were going to build a well in this community. And I don't know anything about that. I just came as an observer. And as they're looking at this, they're trying to figure out where the water is, right, to build a well. And there was an elder in the village who said, the water's over there, under the anthill. And they were like, well, thank you very much, but we have science and tools and all of these things. So they used their tools and determined the water was in fact under the anthill. And it was really interesting because one person had a personal knowledge of the land, right? Other people had a scientific knowledge of the land. But his perspective wasn't valued because it wasn't Western and scientific, because it was personal. And I think this is the same relationship that many indigenous people have of the land. They have a personal knowledge of it and know it because of that. But the West doesn't value the knowledge that they have and doesn't listen. So I think there would be great value in returning ancestral lands and beginning a sort of restorative justice process in that. I don't know how that will happen without us first changing the narrative around land and around belonging. Because even for indigenous people, it was their land historically, but they didn't view it as, it's mine and you can't touch it and you can't come in here. It was seen as this gift, right? So it was okay to share it with other people, but it was not okay to claim it and dispossess other people from it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much again to Karen Gonzalez. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you're welcome to join us for lunch. Let's thank her one more time, and you are dismissed.